Hello, and welcome to today's seminar on Rediscovering Partition from New Perspectives. I'm Chelsea Farrell, the Assistant Director of the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard University. The mission of the Institute is to engage through interdisciplinary research to advance and deepen the understanding of critical issues relevant to South Asia and its relationship with the world. As part of this mission, the Institute is sponsoring today's event that will explore how new research efforts help us to understand the full depth of the history and legacy of partition. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items for today. During the question and answer session, you can submit questions directly to moderators via the Q&A function on Zoom. There will be a short survey automatically sent to you at the end of the session. We would ask that you kindly fill this out. Finally, today's session will be recorded. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Dr. Jennifer Leaning. Dr. Leaning is the Professor of the Practice of Health and Human Rights at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and a Senior Fellow at the Harvard FXB Center. Dr. Leaning has field experience in assessment of issues of public health, human rights, and international humanitarian law in a range of crisis situations. She has been studying the 1947 partition through the lens of forced migration and contemporary humanitarian approaches. Dr. Leaning, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Chelsea, and good day to everybody joining us. And it's a big privilege to be moderating a discussion between two very thoughtful and distinguished colleagues. And I will introduce each of them now and then turn the floor over to the first. So Professor Ian Talbot is a professor at the University of Southampton in Britain. He's director of the Center for Imperial and Post-Colonial Studies there, and he has written probably more prolifically and profoundly about the partition situation and on both sides of the Punjab border and extending as well even to the eastern side of the Indian subcontinent. And our focus today is going to be particularly around the Punjab. So that will be the topic that Professor Talbot will be talking about. And the second very distinguished guest is Professor Yaqoob Bangash, who is an historian. He started out as being an historian rather than turning it to later in life. And he is an expert in the politics and policies that relate to the Punjab, both sides, and his perspective will be from Pakistan, but I know from experience he was deeply steeped in the Indian side of this history as well. And the way we will be proceeding is that I will turn the floor over to Professor Talbot. He will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. I will then ask him a question, and he will reply in however robust a form he chooses. And then we will turn to Professor Bangash, and he will talk. Again, for 10 or 15 minutes, I'll have a question for him. He will reply. And then we will start again with a topic that Professor Talbot will be talking about. And then we'll move quickly to the topic that Professor Bangash will be talking about. And then we're going to mix it up and have the two of them talk back and forth with questions. And it's at that point that we'll also entertain questions from the audience. So we are going to have a pretty solid introduction to the knowledge and judgment of these two really expert analysts of the situation of partition of British India in 1947, but also some of its antecedents and most particularly the consequences that have flowed from that cataclysmic event. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Talbot, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to address the audience on the issue of looking at partition from new perspectives. I think the starting point really in terms of looking at partition is what is the current state of the literature, and also what are the current legacies of partition for the subcontinent. And I think the first thing to bear in mind is that the literature has undergone successive changes, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years. And it's looking more at the lived experience of partition and the way in which ordinary lives were affected by migration, or even those who didn't migrate, their lives were affected by the upheaval. And it's looking at some of these long-term cultural, socioeconomic, and psychological legacies of partition for those people caught up in the event. Now, when I started writing about partition 40 odd years ago, the emphasis wasn't at all on the lived experience of partition. It was still really about what had caused it. Why did it happen? At the time that I began my research, there had been a shift from looking at the high politics, as it was called, the constitutional negotiations, which marked the final years of British rule, more to the region, and to look at what was happening in the regions that were divided. And particularly, of course, I was looking at Punjab. Other people were looking at regions like Bengal, for example, and also they were looking at areas which weren't divided, but were still greatly affected by partition, such as areas like Sindh, for example, the work of Sarah Ansari in that field. So that was the beginning, really, of a movement in the literature away from perhaps why partition happened in terms of the big individuals, Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah's role, and looking more at the regional politics, which in a sense were really important, because without the Muslim League breakthrough in the Punjab region, which I was looking at in my research, then Pakistan might never have come into being. And that was really a crucial question, which hadn't been fully explored at the time that I began my research. So that was the beginning, really, of these constant sort of changes in approach and in focus of writings on partition. And it reflected, in a way, both changes in historical, wider historiography, but also the availability of new sources and the spreading out of the sources, moving away perhaps from just looking at documents, official documents, to newspapers, to party records. When I was looking at the breakthrough of the Muslim League in Punjab, I was looking at the Punjab Muslim League records, which are then held in Karachi. And also we're looking at these developments from the locality rather than necessarily from the national level. What has happened, of course, since then, certainly since the 1990s, as this concern with what I've called the new history of partition, or the history from below of partition. In other words, how were ordinary people affected by, firstly, violence, but also by those who were able to safely relocate across the new international borders, which of course split the two cities of Lahore and Amritsar, which were only about 50 kilometers apart from each other. So this new border is created, and the emphasis now is on how were people who crossed that border safely, how were they able to pick up the threads of their lives again? What were the factors in terms of perhaps government assistance, or in terms of their own if you like, self-resettlement? Why did these factors come into play, you know, in terms of their ability to self-settle? Some ended up in refugee camps. Other people quite quickly acquired property and re-establish business life and activities and professional life. So immediately what you're getting there is the beginnings of a differential experience of partition, in which there are some who are victims who can't recover the losses, the psychological, the material losses of partition, and others who seem to be able to re-establish old patterns of work and indeed their fortune. And that's really, I think, the way in which the literature has moved today, is looking at this differential aspect of the long-term legacy of partition and resettlement. And it's interrogating both official narratives, which were produced by the government of India and the government of Pakistan about this whole rehabilitation process. And it's also interrogating, to an extent, community narratives. which may establish a particular community dominant narrative. In Punjab, for example, it's often the fact that Punjabis as a whole, although there are these great differences across caste, class, and gender in the experience of resettlement, but nonetheless, the dominant Punjabi refugee narrative is that it was through enterprise, entrepreneurship, that Punjabis were able to recover from partition. And sometimes this is juxtaposed with the constructed view, perhaps say, of the Bengali, who was less able to recover from the ravages of partition because they lacked this enterprise. Now, both these official and community narratives of Punjabi exceptionalism are really based on the colonial stereotypes of Punjab, which were internalized and which were used perhaps to try and justify community practices and certainly to give a sense of a success story that was being told in terms of on both sides of Punjab, of this massive dislocation involving probably 11 or 12 million people crossing the Punjab border. And yet this region was able to recover from this dislocation. And of course, the dislocation had been created by violence, which had been endemic in the region, certainly from March 1947 onwards, and it left large areas of urban Punjab on both sides of the border sort of severely damaged. 10,000 houses had been destroyed in Amritsar in the period leading up to partition. 4,000 in Lahore. There'd also been great destruction in Multan. So you can see how partition is coming on the top of this earlier period. Partition migration is coming on top of this earlier period of physical violence and destruction, which goes on for months leading up to partition. And indeed, of course, is a contributory factor in the decision at the higher levels of politics to actually both partition India, but also to partition Punjab along with the partition of India. So this is where the literature has sort of evolved, I think, over the last 2 or 3 decades. And in a sense, this literature has helped to break down some of the stereotypes which were earlier created about the partition experience. So, for example, looking at oral testimonies, you very quickly come to the conclusion that all communities had their victims, all communities had their aggressors. And the view which is sometimes expressed in publications that, or demonizing a particular community, whether it's the Sikhs for violence against Muslims in East Punjab, or whether it's in East Punjab demonizing the Muslims and saying that it was Muslim violence in West Punjab that merely led to retaliation in East Punjab. So you can see how these constructed narratives of partition are beginning to be queried by looking from particularly a localized angle. And indeed, the emphasis is not just on the individual, but the research emphasis has been very much on localities. So there's been studies of, as I did, comparing Lahore and Amritsar and the impact of partition and the lead up to partition in both of those neighboring cities. But there's also been work done on cities such as Lyalpur, or modern day Faisalabad, in Pakistan, and Ludhiana in Indian Punjab, and comparing migrations in those 2 areas and seeing how communities reconstructed, in some senses, their economies in the different post-border setting after migration. And there's been work on other cities comparing how they developed in Pakistan, in Sialkot, Gujranwala, for example. Again, looking at the different trajectories which communities and cities had after partition. So all of this is building up a multi-textured and layered understanding of partition, which I think is a major advance on some of the stereotypical portrayals that dominated perhaps certainly into the 1980s, if not even beyond the 1980s, in writings in both countries. And I think that the final point I really want to make about this is, of course, that understanding the two Punjabs in terms of what they were like before partition is very important as well, in terms of contemporary relationships between India and Pakistan, in terms of breaking down stereotypes, ensuring that there was a pluralism that actually worked, particularly in rural settings, and was disrupted by the politics of 1947 and led to this massive dislocation. So the recovery of what Punjab was like before partition, the recovery also of these differences in terms of experiences in localities, amongst individuals and social classes and groups. All of this, I think, is the trend forward in partition studies with respect to Punjab. And I've been talking about Punjab because that's the area I've worked on over the last 30 or 40 years. But similar themes are emerging if you look at other areas of the subcontinent or other cities. If you look at cities like Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, all of these cities, you see highly differentiated experiences of refugee rehabilitation. Also, if you look at other regions of India, Sindh, for example, or UP, you see again, perhaps interconnections which are there in Punjab in terms of migration. This has been brought out in a very recent publication, Borders of Belonging, which looks at sort of that process. So that's really the state of play, I think, in terms of the literature on partition.
Thank you. That's a pretty elegant summary. I'd like you to dive into a particularly interesting topic, which you know very well and have written about, and others have, which is deconstructing the notion that it was a mass frenzy and a mass frenzy of killing by everybody against everybody, which was part of the horror of partition. Partition had its horrors, its abrupt ones and its lingering ones, certainly. But this notion that certainly pervaded Indians, that is, Indian citizens of the new India, was in the old ways of looking at it, one that was so tinged with shame at how there had been so much killing and outrage. And Yaqoob, you can speak on the Pakistani side, but there was also this question of how could a society that had, very, very wonderful religious and moral values get so consumed in this period from, well, let's say March of 1947 until easily the summer of 1948. And you've looked at this from the Punjab standpoint, Ian. I was hoping you could say a little bit more about this from the precision that we now understand about how the violence was provoked and how it was directed.
Yes, I mean, the violence was not sort of irrational, spontaneous, frenzied killings. Where violence occurred, it was very much with a political purpose, directed for a purpose. Some people would say ethnic cleansing lay behind a lot of the violence that was occurring in the Punjab region, as people were in a way trying to establish, and this includes the violence leading up to the publication of the Boundary Award, establish their dominance in a particular area. And the way to do this was through the use of violence. And I think that a lot of the actual perpetrators of violence were paid goondas from criminal classes. They weren't always ordinary individuals. There were ex-servicemen who had been trained. There were members of paramilitary organizations also who undertook violence. And all of this occurred within the breakdown of functioning administration. And I think that that's important because it enables people to act with impunity. And that I think was a key factor in the violence. So it's a political struggle for dominance. And obviously, each individual episode of violence might have its own catalyst. And you know, it might be the spread of rumors. It might be repaying old scores off that is a factor in violence. It may be that it's a particularly disturbed area anyway, with large criminality. And that would be an interesting way to look at it in future, to say, were areas that had high crime rates in the years leading up to partition, were these areas that were particularly disturbed? I mean, obviously, people like Stephen Wilkinson has tried to link areas of disturbance in violence with military service, active military service during the Second World War. But I think if you looked at some of the first information reports from police stations in areas which had high levels of disturbance in 1947, you might find that some of the perpetrators of that were very well known criminal gangs who had a reputation for sort of cattle lifting and other crimes, perhaps, that was known to the authorities. And they were in the pay, perhaps, of local political groups who wanted to use them in order to try and access dominance within this particular territory. So I think that is very important. The incidences of violence, of course, are not uniform. You have perhaps villages next to each other, one of which has complete massacre of population, the other which is unaffected. You know, you have these sort of differences in the incidence of violence. And is that because of local histories? Is it because of who the local dominant groups are, who might be able to squash violence? Others may not want to squash it because it serves their purpose. You know, you may have all kinds of factors coming into play. It may just be, you know, that outsiders see a good opportunity to loot a particular community and have looked for that opportunity for a long time. With the breakdown of law and order, and also, I suppose, they could present what they were doing in terms of having social and political support. They take this opportunity to do looting and repaying old scores. So it's a very complex process, but it's not that violence is everywhere. If you look at Malayakotla, for example, there was no violence there, and a large Muslim community, this is within the eastern Punjab area, that's a princely state, sort of survived. So that there are these sort of differences. And also, if you look at oral testimonies, whilst there aren't as many that show individuals protecting people from another community, even at the risk of their own lives, these episodes do exist, and perhaps haven't been given the prominence in narration that they may have be now likely to be given. So that there are all of these factors, I think, at play. So it's a complex picture.
Always more work to be done, isn't there?
There's always more work to be done, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for this. Professor Bangash, you will be speaking on, well, a wide range of things. And what I would like to do in terms of our audience here is to say that, you know, historians of many periods in many countries in the last 50 years have moved from the high politics to the particularities. It's not just South Asia that has been subjected to this, I think, very positive scrutiny, but it's a bit late in terms of how we were looking at, say, you know, British labor and the rise of the union movement in Great Britain. There was a whole historiography that basically was about turning over the rocks and seeing what was going on underneath. And you have a very big talent for doing this, you know, for looking at foreground, background, what is revelatory that people haven't actually noticed before. And so I'm very pleased that we can turn the floor over to you and have you speak from your deep knowledge of the documents and the circumstances from not just the Pakistan side, but from this side that was actually trying to make sense of and restore order in the very early days. So please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Jennifer. And I'm quite happy to be back on the Mitchell Institute's platform again. I should just want to sort of remember how I got interested in partition, and it's actually related to you because it's your visit to Pakistan a few years ago when we first met that actually sparked my interest, because till that time I thought everything had been done on partition, and there was nothing more to actually write on partition, because so many books, and Ian's of course had done seminal work on it, Gurapal Singh and so many others from the 1990s, as Ian points out. Lots of people had looked at the subaltern aspect, so the high politics and the low politics, everything had been done to a large extent. So I thought, okay, it's done and dusted. And then if you remember, we went to the Punjab archives and we went through those rooms that no one had really looked into, where things were just thrown in.
Wasn't that incredible? That was so incredible. Yeah,
I know.
That. Yeah. Yeah,
exactly. And I just, after your visit, and when we also were there, we just picked up random books and began to look at them. So I continued doing that in the months afterwards, and then saw that there were lots of things that weren't part of the historiography of partition, and that people hadn't really worked on. So after completely thinking that partition had been done and dusted, everything had been done, the last word on partition had actually been written, then I all of a sudden ended up looking at partition again. And by now actually I've worked on 3 or 4 aspects that actually relate to partition, which we will of course talk about in the later times. But let me just pick up from where kind of Ian left, talking about the violence. And I think what even in the high politics, and I think one of the things that has happened since the 1990s is that we have focused very rightly on the lived experience, on the subaltern experience, and how the common people kind of felt, because that was completely ignored beforehand. One reason for that, of course, was, at least on the Pakistani side that I saw, was that a lot of people did not want to talk about the partition. It was too close in the 50s and 60s for them to actually talk about it. And it only takes up till about the 90s that people begin to kind of, open up about it. Like I still remember from my own family, like my mom, she's from that generation. She was in college at that time, but she doesn't really speak about the partition even now, and just says, oh yeah, let's just not talk about it. So a lot of people just never did. And I think it took a long time till they got to a certain age and they began to finally open up. So at some level, the 80s opening up and the early 90s opening up was the right time in that sense too. But I think what's happened since then is that a lot of the high politics and even the middle tier, and I'll come back to it, has been lost, because no one now looks at the high politics. No one now looks at the middle tier. The focus is solely on kind of a very locality based, people based thing, which of course, as Ian has also mentioned and others have worked on, gives us a very useful understanding of what happened at partition, but doesn't complete the picture. I'll just give you just a couple of interesting examples, which I just saw even in terms of high politics. As a lot of people have written, that a lot of the partition violence began after the 15th of August. That's when the ethnic cleansing really kind of picked up. And I found it really fascinating when just, randomly looking at some material that I found the very interesting correspondence, which I'm sure Ian knows really well, between the governor of East Punjab, Sir Chandulal, and the Home Minister of East Punjab, Swaran Singh. And that was really interesting, is that here the governor, the Indian appointed governor, writes to the Home Minister saying, Muslims are being killed in large numbers in the Punjab. What are you actually doing about this? And the Home Minister doesn't reply. He writes again, doesn't reply. He writes a third time. Then he replies and says, well, it's, it was bound to happen, and doesn't really care about it. So I think one of the things which again has been kind of lost in this thing is, as Ian very rightly said, it wasn't spontaneous, and it wasn't that the people in power did not know. I actually think, asking me to, rather than saying that it was a breakdown of a law and order, it was a very planned breakdown of law and order. Swaran Singh could control this. Swaran Singh chose to look the other way. And he chose to actually say, I'm not really going to talk about this. I'm not going to prevent anyone from killing people. This is something that I kind of implicitly agree with. And I think that correspondence kind of very much shows that. In terms of migration, people have worked on the migration from Lailpur, and I found it really fascinating is that the migration from Lailpur, perhaps, as far as I've read, might not have happened if the Indian High Commission had not insisted that that happened. Because they wanted people, Hindus and Sikhs from Lailpur, which was actually a Hindu and Sikh majority city, go to the other side so they could send Muslims these ways. So a lot of the political high command, and after the 15th of August, a lot of the governments on both East and West Punjab are very, very integral to what happens afterwards. And in some ways, it's very, very planned, very minutely planned. At some, and the third thing that I just wanted to highlight there is the role of refugees. Of course, very recently, a lot of very good and interesting work has come out on the refugees. But I really found it fascinating. In my sort of previous incarnation, I worked on the princely states, and there I found it was fascinating that let's say the princely state of Bahawalpur, no violence had happened in Bahawalpur till the arrival of refugees. And it was very interesting. Sir Pendrell Moon actually mentioned this in his work, that as soon as the Muslim refugees arrived from East Punjab, they saw a Sikh and killed him, and that's how the violence kind of picks up even in a place like Bahawalpur. So there are lots of interesting themes that I think really need to be still picked up in terms of the high politics, which actually inform a lot of what is happening on the ground. And I think those kind of trends really need to be now mixed up. I think we have done both sides independently, but that needs to be brought together. Now coming to the interesting documents that I found on the floor of that very interesting room that we saw about three years ago, I think. And that was really fascinating, because one of the things which I saw was this very interesting document called the Punjab Partition Council and the Punjab Partition Committee and its minutes. And what that really showed was that a lot of the discussion of how the Punjab was going to be split was had taken place. And what I found really fascinating is that very few works even mentioned it, let alone detailing what it did. It's really a footnote. It's really mentioned in passing, because of course the Boundary Commission gets the bulk of the focus. And through looking through that document, there were several important elements of the partition history that I think the partition narrative that had actually been forgotten. And I thought that, that must be taken into consideration, because that again shows us interesting elements of what was happening there. So the first thing there, of course, is the question of cooperation. And I found it fascinating that at the height of summer 1947, you had regional politicians working together to amicably split the Punjab. And that again, Ian's work and a couple of other people have pointed it out, that it's not necessarily that what was happening in the center was being replicated in the provinces. And even Aisha Jalal actually writes about that, the Punjab had to really kind of take in partition as a given, rather than having any active, proactive role in making it happen. But if you look at the partition committee, that actually shows that a lot of people were cooperating, a lot of people were agreeing on a number of things, and this was continuing throughout the summer. As violence was picking up, there were still elements of agreement. And if I can just point out a couple of elements of agreement, and I really found them fascinating, because they'd been kind of mentioned on and off somewhere, but no one had really made a big deal about this. So for example, both East and West Punjab had agreed that they were going to jointly jointly have police training for a number of years. And this I found really fascinating. Police was largely Muslim. It had been politicized to a large extent. And here you have the Inspectors General of Police from both East and West Punjab agreeing and saying, oh, in East Punjab, in Philor, they will do the training for a couple of years to come, and that's completely fine. Then, which was really fascinating, was that electricity was under a joint control for nearly a year after partition. And I really found it fascinating that it's only kind of towards the middle of 1948 that East Punjab begins to realize, why are we giving electricity to West Punjab? They haven't paid us, and the whole thing then kind of blows up. But till that time, I found it fascinating that from the Mandi hydroelectric dam, the main line comes through Lahore and then goes to through East Punjab. So that also shows us that yes, there was a line that divided them on the 17th of August, but that line didn't really become firm or anything for years to come. It was a very kind of a fluid thing. And then the third thing, which is a very small thing, but I still found it really fascinating, was that West Punjab is telling East Punjab that, oh, if you need a printing press, you can still use the printing press in Lahore. And this, why did I find it fascinating, was that the East Punjab government was going to move to Simla, where the government of India had their printing press. So they could have easily said, well, now you're going there, you can use the government of India as one. But they said, no. If you really want a printing to be done, just send us your things and you can print this here. The same thing goes, when I've now done a whole article on it about Punjab University. They actually wanted to jointly run Punjab University till, of course, very sadly, the registrar of Punjab University gets murdered in Lahore. So there's a lot of cooperation that is actually taking place on the ground, and the grand picture of these two parties, or three parties for that matter, in the Punjab at each other's sort of heads, that's true to a certain extent. But at the regional level, at the provincial level, the politicians are cooperating, the civil servants are cooperating, and it's only when the violence just really takes off after the 15th of August and it becomes practically impossible to actually jointly work on a number of issues, that a lot of issues end up in conflict. But even then, I really find it fascinating that it's really the summer of 48 that umbilical cord is actually cut. So I think that's a very important thing to look at. The other thing that the Punjab partition committee shows is, and again, this is the first time that local ICS officers, and of course that again is a very interesting discussion, how they are ICS officers and the whole Punjab cadre thing, which is another discussion. But this is the first time that Indian, Hindu and Muslim ICS officers actually take over. And this is kind of, one of the arguments that I write in my paper is that this is the setting up of these new states, or East and West Pakistan, in July 1947, because for the first time, they don't have a British ICS officer above them to whom they are reporting, and they are the ones who are actually making the final decision. So the chief secretary designate of East Punjab, the chief secretary designate of West Punjab, on the one side a Hindu, on the other side a Muslim, they are the ones who are actually deciding and kind of really doing a very interesting procurement kind of a process for their new provinces and by extension the new states. And the way they do it is also again really fascinating, that they agree on most of the things, and it's only about 4 or 5 very contentious issues that they disagree on. And this again, brings us into what Joya Chatterjee, and it's very sad that she is not here with us today, but she has called this a secularization of the process, that where after a time, even though this is a very communal decision to split the Punjab, but the process, in fact, if you look at the nuts and bolts of the process, that becomes secularized to a large extent. And this, the way the Punjab was actually divided, is, I think, a very good example of that secularization of the process. So yes, Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims all want to kill each other. They are at loggerheads. But then when you come to the when you come to these civil servants and the actual nuts and bolts of dividing the Punjab, it's a very secular process, and it's a process to set up a new province. It is a process to set up a new country, for that matter. And I think that again has been not been actually dealt with to a large extent. So these are the and I don't want to go on and on, but I think there are certain strands in terms of how partition was looked at through this. Then the partition committee is really the middle tier of the partition saga, which has been missing from our analysis, because we know the top politicians, we know the local people. Well, what's happening in this middle tier? Because these are the real, these ICS officers that that I've looked at. These are the ones who are actually conducting the partition, but they're also being partitioned at the same time. And what's really fascinating is, and I've given examples of several cases, several personal cases. Even they are very confused also what's happening. So this is very fascinating to look at, that all these different tiers, how they understand partition, what is their part in it, and how do they affect it. And what is fascinating is these are the people who affected perhaps by the end of it more than the central politicians, but their narrative was just completely lost up till this time. So in the grand scheme of things, there are all these different nuts and bolts that I think if we begin to piece together even now, we'd be able to understand more about the partition, and as Ian's actually work has shown, understand how the new countries were actually set up and how actually East and West Punjab were set up. So the partition, as Wazir Zamindar has actually spoken about the long partition, more from the perspective of the UP and migration, it's the long partition for both the Punjabs also. And I think that needs to be recovered to a large extent in the narrative. And I think there are these, bits and pieces which have not been looked at.
Yes, thank you. In the discussions we've had and what you've shared in your sense of the proceedings of the partition committee and then the council suggests that there's a level of professionalism in this administrative class on both sides of the new border that is retained, and mutual respect. I mean, there is little sparks of acrimony in the minutes, but the minutes themselves are beautifully written and decorous and formal and polite. It contrasts markedly with what, to some extent, is perceived because of the high narrative or the people's narrative as one that is complete frenzy. I mean, these are people that are thinking carefully and talking carefully with each other. And if you could say a little bit more about Punjab University and why it turned out to be so complicated, and what the final solution was, at least in terms of the ultimate solution, I'm not entirely sure, but how they, in these months of talking, determined that in fact this is not a divisible problem.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. Well, Punjab University is a really fascinating case because it is one of the most contentious ones. And I always sort of thought and say, well, they've agreed to split everything, more or less, but why Punjab University? And as far as I've been able to understand, one of the main reasons why Punjab University becomes contentious is that it's one institution that, rather than the government setting up, a lot of the people had a role in setting it up, and all three communities had a very integral role in setting it up, because of course the whole history of Punjab University goes back to the Anjuman-e-Punjab and this whole movement of setting up this vernacular university. And what is different about Punjab University is that it's the first university in the British Empire, well, in the British Indian Empire, that from its inception examines in the vernacular languages, and it's actually set up for the promotion of vernacular languages. Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras never did that at that time. So there is this great sense of pride in terms of the people of the Punjab that we have set this wonderful university that not only teaches English but teaches in Arabic, in Sanskrit, in Persian, and in Punjabi, of course. So I think that makes it a very special kind of an institution. Now, when it comes to splitting it, of course, the Hindu and Sikhs want this split, and one side going to India. The Muslims want it kept on one side. It's a very long kind of a narrative, but the short version is that when they get legal advice from the Central Partition Committee and the Government of India, they say, well, it cannot be split because it is its own body corporate. But what is fascinating about this is that the people who leave Punjab University, they go to India, and they set up a parallel Punjab University. And they call it Punjab University. So if you go to, and again, I really found it fascinating that if you go to the Punjab University Chandigarh's website, it doesn't even, the short description they have doesn't even mention partition. It just says it began in Lahore, and then it moved to Chandigarh without mentioning, well, actually there was this huge partition, and actually it did not move to Chandigarh. And this is fascinating because a number of colleges, of course, moved. So there was the Laipur Khalsa College, and there were a couple of other colleges that actually, practically, except for the physical buildings, the whole college moved to India. So the Laipur Khalsa College is still called the Laipur Khalsa College, even though it is now in East Punjab. But the Punjab University is the only one that actually both sides claim was set up exactly at the same time, 1882, and both of them claim its legacy. And that I found was, again, a very particular kind of a Punjabi narrative, so to speak. And I think that really tells you about how, even in this middle tier, there was a sense of being Punjabi, and this Punjab University kind of exhibited that. And that is what was being showcased. So this, perhaps one can even call it this Punjabi resistance to being split. For that, there was this one very small example of the Punjab University, and they really tried at the beginning. They really tried to have Punjab University on both sides, and it was very sad that the registrar of Punjab University, because he was a Sikh, when he visited Lahore, he was stabbed to death actually right outside his office. And that's when the East Punjab government decided, no, we need to set something up completely. But before that, they really were fine with the university physically being at Lahore, and then examining and even affiliating colleges on both sides. And what I really find fascinating is that in October 47, they get a re-affiliation letter, the university at Lahore, they get a re-affiliation letter from a college in Jammu. And this is right before Jammu Jammu and Kashmir, like the whole kind of battle over the state begins. So it's really interesting also from the idea of Jammu. Legally speaking, Jammu and Kashmir is an independent country by October 47, but yet it still wants to affiliate with that college still wants to affiliate with Punjab University. So there are all these examples, and I think there must be more. It's from that heap of lots of documents. I only picked up one document, and I've ended up working on it for a number of years. Imagine what else is in there. One of the other fascinating things, which I think, if you remember, were these fascinating deputy commissioner meeting minutes that were held every couple of months, and they even noted how many people were wandering in the streets, which I found really funny at one level, and saying, how are they counting those people? So the refugees wandering in the streets, they even had a number about that. So this whole idea about really trying to understand what is happening for this middle tier, trying to make sense of it and secularizing it and actually cooperating, the level of cooperation between East and West Punjab, even after the massacres, is, I think, to some extent, very remarkable, actually, because, they shouldn't be able to see each other's faces, but the meetings of the Punjab Partition Committee, actually, the last one is about 1958 or something.
Exactly.
So it's really interesting that, they keep meeting and they keep discussing and they keep solving problems, and there's still some issues, and they go back and forth. And it's very interesting in how the two Punjabs at some level are integral to the split and are integral to the antagonism between India and Pakistan, but at the same level are actually interesting examples of cooperation in some very important and critical ways. So it's a very mixed bag, as Ian was actually saying, and I think we are still learning more and more about this, even 73 years down the line.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I think it's good that you're both speaking this way, because the sinews and the tissue that form the connections of the society across this arbitrary border were very difficult to sever abruptly. And in many ways, who wanted them to be severed is another question, because there was a lot of anguish and enormous friendships and professional ties across this very complex country. I mean, this state of Punjab, and it's so there is a poignancy about the partition committee and the council and the way you trace it that I think is a very good, real, but also symbolic statement about what if, what might, how these people actually were behaving in their educated and responsible roles throughout this high level of violence and carnage. There are two and probably some more very good questions from the audience. So what I will say now for our next move is, can you keep your remarks to about 5 minutes about the second topic you want to talk about? Is that okay? And then we will have some discussion between you, the two of you, and then I will open up for the response from questions to the audience. Is that okay? So let's, so Professor Ian Talbot, it is back to you for 5 minutes of your next vast topic that you would like to cover.
Okay, thank you. What I'm wanting to look at now is how the impending 75th anniversary of partition will be both commemorated and what its impact will be on the historiography. Because a lot of these anniversaries of partition have actually been periods of time when there's been a major rethink in terms of the understanding of partition. If you go back to 1997, that's really the time, that the 50th anniversary, where people began to think seriously about history from below. And I think it's not a coincidence that was the fact. So how are people going to look at partition on the 75th anniversary? And I'm interested really in three particular areas, which I will cover very briefly. Firstly, I think that there is still more work that can be done on how migrants were able to recover from the losses of partition, and how their effective ties, both with people from their own district who they may be living alongside, but also perhaps with officials who came from that district, how that impacts on issues like evacuee property, for example. And I think that element could certainly be a dimension that could be looked at in urban context and in a comparative way. You could look at how this operates, for example, in Delhi, how it operates perhaps in Lahore, Amritsar, but also the way in which it might operate in a totally different context, say in Eastern India, in Calcutta. You know, how do these ties actually, how are they operationalized, and how effective are they? Are effective ties, in other words, effective in enabling you to resettle? That's the first thing which I think is of interest. The second thing, which I think certainly is of interest to me, is looking at the environmental aspects of partition, which really haven't been covered that much. You get lots of accounts in personal testimonies of the dangers of crossing flooded rivers, crisscrossing Punjab. You also get some accounts in newspapers of refugees who, when they've made it to their new home, actually die when their house that they're in collapses under the pressure of the monsoon rains, because the house has been damaged and they've got nowhere else to stay. You know, and there's a lot of press recording around it, often about the anniversary of partition, partly because this coincides obviously with the monsoon period. But I was reading quite recently, actually, about August 1948, and how 18 refugees in a house that had been abandoned by Hindus in the Shalalmi area of Lahore collapsed and killed them all under the pressure of the monsoon rains. And as a result of this, 2,000 refugees stormed the Lahore Municipal Corporation the next day and vandalized it in protest at the fact that nothing was being done to shore up these properties. And I think that that's an interesting short-term sort of environmental aspect of partition, and it feeds into this whole issue of differential experiences. Why is it that some refugees are more vulnerable to environmental risk, perhaps, than others? And I think that's an interesting question that could be looked at. Going forward, you could say, how did local government and urban planning responses to this mass migration, unprecedented, 43% of the population of Lahore were refugees, 1951. How did they respond to this? And did the planning processes that they introduced actually establish what might be called a kind of long-term sort of environmental vulnerability? which is being shown very much today, you know, in terms of flooding at monsoon time, but also air pollution. You know, how is the planning in response to this refugee influx? How does that create perhaps long-term problems? The other area I just want to very briefly mention, which is new technology, which struck me when it was pointed out actually by Rakesh Ankit, a former PhD student of mine. He's talking about Project Dastan, which has been launched initially from Oxford University and has Yasmin Khan, who I'm sure Yaqoob knows very well, as one of its sponsors. You know, and this is a project which is looking forward to the 75th anniversary in terms of wanting to undertake 75 interviews with partition survivors, as they call them. But it then wants to take these people back to their childhood locations through the use of virtual reality technology. And this project is also aimed at setting up an interactive virtual reality documentary experience, which will put the viewer in the shoes of a 1947 migrant. And the aim is to distribute this to film festivals and museums. And the final element is obviously a documentary for younger members of the diaspora who are very interested in partition and in the migrations of their grandparents, but who really don't know anything about it. And it's a means of introducing them to the lived experience of partition. So in a sense, that this is an academic come activist project using new technology in order really to further some of the aims perhaps of the new history, which I was talking about, you know, which has emerged in the past 3 decades. I think that's something that's very interesting as we look forward to 1970 to the 75th anniversary in 2022.
It's fascinating. It's excellent. Yeah. And new technologies are being used in a number of ways in terms of crowdsourcing, and I would just say this last one with the virtual reality, somebody should do a human subjects review of it though, in terms of how shocking it might be to these old people to have a virtual reality. So that will need to be carefully curated, I would think. But that I'm sure is occurring to the people who are doing this. And it will be just riveting thing to have for the 75th. Yeah, thank you, Ian. So Yaqoob, 5 minutes about the topic you were prepared to talk 10 or 15 minutes about, but if you could sort of collapse it a bit, that would be wonderful.
Sure, of course. Well, I just want to begin, so I'll just speak on two things. First is from where actually Ian left off, the issue of technology. Of course, a lot of people are using it, but I want to kind of, see it in the broader picture, and actually sort of foreground this in a discussion. And again, because the 75th anniversary of partition is coming up, foregrounded this in this whole discussion on the whole partition industry that has kind of developed. And I think that's a really fascinating topic. I actually see on the participants list Dr. Pippa Verdi, and she's been working on it for a couple of months, from what I hear, and she has actually uncovered, she's one of the things that she actually talks about, and I think it is very interesting in how it's kind of mimicked memory and Holocaust studies. And how these different strands are actually coming together. So people are using family histories to no end. People are talking about lived experiences. Now we have AR, VR coming in. What does it mean to actually have this partition industry, and what effect does it have on how we look at partition and remember partition? And I think these are very important questions that, as the 75th anniversary and start to say, I think probably frenzy that will take over. What is it actually doing to the field? What is it actually doing to research? What is it actually doing to reality and our imagination of it? I'll just point out one thing that Dr. Verdi also looks at, is that a lot of these interventions, these new interventions, are actually not by people in either East or West Punjab. They are by the diaspora. So that's a very interesting way of looking at it, that actually people in East and West Punjab, you know, and I used to go, now, of course, because of Modi, I don't go that much, but I used to go to Indian Punjab, like, you know, every couple of weeks for that matter, every other month. And, you know, we get along with each other. We had good chats and we connected people across the borders. But we didn't really think about these things in these ways that the diaspora thinks about. So the whole effect of diaspora thinking now kind of, you know, doing the work for us, so to speak. What does that mean? You know, so all these kinds of ancillary questions, I think as we look towards 75 years, and I think these kinds of interventions will only increase, you know, crowdsourcing, you know, all these other kinds of things, these will only increase. What does that really do? And I think one needs to be a bit careful about that and really kind of, be very circumspect about what it's actually doing to the field and to research. So I think that's one sort of large thing that I just wanted to highlight and sort of move on from. The second thing that I really want to talk about, and this is something which I'm doing currently, so I don't have a kind of a final end product there, is that I'm working on how Indian Christians actually looked at the partition. And I picked this up because I think the only thing that's really been written on Indian Christians and partition was actually in an edited volume. And I think he must have been a student of Ian's, a graduate student of Ian's, that actually wrote about it using the Mountbatten papers. And I thought, wow, you know, that's it, really. So, you know, I was just got interested in it and really began to look at it. And what I really want to do there is to actually bring not just the narrative in terms of partition, but then also bring it into what happened to them in East and West Punjab in the period immediately following partition. Now, why am I doing it? Well, for the most part, because yes, there were Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims in the Punjab, but in northern India, Christians were the largest. The province that the Christians were the largest number in northern India was the Punjab, and there were about 500,000 Christians in the Punjab at that time. So that's, you know, one demographic thing. Secondly, that the impact on the development of the Punjab, I think, was exceptional. There was hardly a district in the Punjab that did not have a Christian school, a Christian dispensary, or any kind of missionary presence. And that made them kind of their impact larger than their numbers. And what I really found fascinating is that, again, in the history of the partition, they are kind of seldom mentioned. So I think that was a very interesting kind of gap there. And where in terms of West Punjab, I became very interested is that 50, 60 years down the line, I think it kind of began about 40 years down the line, lots of myths began to emerge about Christians and the partition. So I'll just speak of one myth. One big myth about Christians and the partition was that this leader of one of the Christian groups, Diwan Bahadur S.P. Singha, interestingly, the whole name is Satya Prakash Singha, which of course shows that he's from Hindu descent. He votes for Pakistan during the partition proceedings. And the myth then emerged about 30, 40 years after partition. And of course, the guy actually dies a few months after partition. But then a myth emerges that it was his casting vote that actually led to the creation of Pakistan. Now, you know, a lot of Christians in Pakistan believe it. That is part of their foundational myth, that is how they are full members of Pakistan. And a lot of them get very annoyed and angry when I actually show them the proceedings of the Punjab Assembly and say, yes, he did vote for with the Muslim League, but that the difference of numbers was so much that it didn't make a difference. And they get really angry and they were like, no, but this report must be false. You know, this report of the Punjab Assembly is wrong because, you know, my father told me that that's the case. So I really found it fascinating that in West Punjab, the Christians had to come up with this foundational myth about how they took part in the Punjab, in the creation of Pakistan, and the partition of the Punjab would not have happened without their agreement, which is a myth. So then I began to get interested in why is this the case, and I'm currently working on it. Another very interesting incident that actually comes up in the Punjab, and again, you know, Ian was actually talking about how these migrants kind of habilitate themselves in this different environment. So it's very much connected to it, is that when these East Punjab Muslims come to West Punjab and take over from, you know, Hindu and Sikh lands, a very interesting thing happens, that a lot of Christians who are working on these lands get thrown out because only the Muslims are supposed to be there. Now, you had all these Christians who were very pro-Muslim League, But come January 1948, and SP Singh actually talks about it, and they're actually thrown out because they are not Muslims, and only Muslims have a right to now exist in the Punjab. So it's very interesting in how this whole kind of, and it's not an inconsiderable number of Christians. There are thousands of what these people are called mazaras that are actually thrown out, and this becomes a huge issue. And then they become refugees in West Punjab, even though they are from West Punjab. So that becomes a very interesting side of the whole Christian debate. The third side, which again is really fascinating, and I only kind of realized it a couple of years ago when I went to Sialkot, was that a lot of the outcasts, so the lower caste, the untouchables, when they realized that, well, partition is going to happen, they were sort of weighing their options, which side they'd be good at. And of course, if they went to East Punjab, they'll still be untouchables. So a lot of the untouchables in Sialkot, for example, on the eve of partition and just afterwards, become Christians. And that again is really, 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 really fascinating, because that's that's purely a political conversion, nothing to do with religion. And a lot of them keep practicing their old religious practices. And I found this really fascinating. I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago when I went to Sialkot, actually with Dr. Verdi and a couple of other colleagues, just looking through Gurdwaras. And in one of the Gurdwaras, Beri Sahib, there were all these Sikhs there, and we're like, why are so many Sikhs in Sialkot? We never thought there were hundreds of Sikhs in Sialkot. Well, these were the people who, because of partition, had converted. These were kind of lower caste Hindus who had converted to Christianity. And now, because they had realized that after 50, 60 years, that Sikhism was very acceptable in Pakistan. In fact, Sikhism was very much promoted in Pakistan, that they had now become Sikhs. So this, agency of these untouchables during the time of partition is, I think, really, really, really fascinating. So these are the kinds of things that I think, again, are these gaps in partition work that are still to be explored. These untouchables. It was very fascinating in how they actually maneuvered themselves, and then as actually Ian's work also shows, that Gurapal Singh's too, and a couple of others, that a number of times when violence was actually taking place, a lot of Christians, or these recently converted Christians, would put a cross outside their house to say, "We are Christians, don't kill us," and they'd be saved. So it's very interesting in how these kind of lower castes are actually using using a particular religion, one, not to die, and then to maneuver in the new country they are in to get to certain positions, and how in the recent past, just a few years ago, they've now moved to another religion, because now that religion is kind of a privileged minority religion in Pakistan. So it's not again the question of what happened at the time of partition, or even the couple of years beyond that. I'm talking about 2017 and 18, and how things that happened at the time of partition are still developing and are still taking shape.
Good. It's going to be a very rich exploration. And livelihoods will be very important in terms of who is designated to be a farmer. This is, the livelihoods of Christians and poor Muslims collided in several settings that you've referenced. I think I'm now going to change course again for both of you. You might as well. I have no idea what time it is for you both, but thank you for doing this. There are several very good questions from people who are staying with us. And so I would like to start from the top and not have a discussion between and among the three of us, but get to the questions, because people have asked some very good ones. Is that okay with both of you? We do that? Okay. You could object, but I think we should do this. All right, so I'm going to start with one. So I'm not sure this plays exactly to what either of you are studying, but one question is about the Cold War and why the British were interested in having Pakistan succeed, that is succeed, as a buffer against what they termed, or they were worried about, as leftist movements in India. And I'm not sure that is how the question really is characterizing it, but yes, it is actually, that's what it is. So in terms of, you don't have to take that summary what the motives were, but as the early Cold War, which was really heating up in 47, 46 even, but 47, 48, I know that the British were really interested when they were figuring about whether partition was going to happen and the division of the subcontinent. They basically looked very carefully at who had come in as a foreigner into India, subcontinent India, and looking for radicals, terrorists, subversives, anybody from Eastern Europe, certainly anybody from Germany, and anybody from China was closely scrutinized in terms of their political valence within the Indian subcontinent. And this is early on. This is in late 1946, early 1947. So there clearly was an edge of the British high political mind that was concerned about the Cold War. Brief responses. If I could ask of each of you, and one of you can go first. Let's reverse here and have Yaku go first, and then I'll ask Ian, and then we'll go to the next question. But brief, please.
Okay, I think Ian knows a lot more about this because he has actually done finished work on the British High Commissions in both India and Pakistan. So he is very much plugged into what happens in the Cold War. But my short answer with that is my only real understanding of that is from this large book written by Sarila about a decade ago, I think. And that was the big claim being made there. I don't really think that the Cold War thing was that important at that moment. It was at the back of their mind, yes. But the whole argument, and I think some people have pushed it, that Pakistan was created as this pro-British bastion of the Cold War. I think that's just later thinking that's been projected backwards. I don't think it was really important at that time. I don't think they really cared about it to that extent at that time. You know, one example, if I may give there, is that the Americans didn't even appoint an ambassador to Pakistan for about a year. So if Pakistan was that critical as a frontline state for the Cold War, at least the Americans should have had someone here immediately. So, you know, I would doubt that, but I think Ian can shed a lot more light on it. I could be completely wrong here too, but I think Ian can speak on it better.
Yeah, I think, you know, as far as the Cold War is concerned, the British looked at this in terms of a continuation of the Great Game. And certainly they wanted the security and stability of the north of India. Doesn't mean to say they wanted Pakistan to be created as a bastion, which is what Sarila argues. But certainly once Pakistan came into being, those who, not just diplomats, but also the pro-Pakistan group within the British cabinet, as opposed to the pro-India group, were very concerned that Pakistan might collapse. And if it did collapse after independence, then that would have serious strategic issues for Britain. And also, of course, you could say that the original intention for common defense of the subcontinent by India and Pakistan was again perhaps a response to an awareness that in future there might be a problem, you know, and that the subcontinent as a whole needed to be strong and to be stable. So I think that's where it comes into it, you know, in terms of British diplomacy and strategic thinking. But certainly Sarila is off the mark, you know, in terms of arguing that Pakistan was deliberately designed by Britain in order to be a bastion of its influence. I think it was more the fact that once the British had conceded the notion of partition, that they wanted some defense link up between India and Pakistan. I think that's important.
Thank you both. Another question starts at a level of generality that I'd like you to dive into quickly and deal with. Ian, I'll start with you on this. It's sort of what motivated people in Pakistan and India to migrate? I don't think it's an uninformed question. I think it is the point that there are a lot of people that didn't move. And certainly if you get out of the Punjab, there are a lot of people that didn't move. There are a large number of Muslims in India and in Pakistan, you know, certainly as Jinnah was proceeding, was going to be room for a very diverse number of different kinds of people initially. So with that as the background, we, all three of us know, and I'm sure the person asking the question knows, that there was enormous violence and fear. But could you say something, each of you, that is a little bit more fine-grained than that? What motivated people to leave what is now Pakistan, and vice versa? What motivated people to leave what is now India?
I mean, if you're looking just at the Punjab region, of course, the two states, virtually through the military evacuation organization, orchestrated an exchange of population, which I think Yaqoob mentioned earlier, meant that people, like the Sikh colonists in Lahore, who didn't really want to move necessarily, had no choice but to. So it's in a sense, after the chaos of the first 2 or 3 weeks and the massacres and the failure of the boundary force to maintain order, then the two states, as far as Punjab are concerned, try and sort of organize population movements in order to ensure both the safety of minority populations, but once these get underway, it's in order to move people out, to provide accommodation, businesses, land that incomers, refugee incomers, are able to take up. That's the Punjab situation. In Bengal, it's a very different process. I mean, migration doesn't happen in either acute circumstances of violence or orchestrated state actions. Both the government of India and the government of Pakistan, you can see this in the Liaquat-Nehru Pact in 1950, really didn't want people to migrate in that part of the subcontinent and wanted them to return, if at all possible. And that creates a very different context. But of course, whenever there are sort of communal riots or whenever there's tension between India and Pakistan, that certainly raises concerns of the Hindu population of East Pakistan. So you have this sort of a wave after wave that goes on, for a decade or more, 2 decades, of migration in Bengal. And it's often not even the result of violence, but more the threat or fear of violence, or the fact that they feel that their status has been undermined and they can't maintain a respectable life anymore in the way that they wanted to. So I'm talking about the Badrolok class in East Bengal, so that they might consider moving. So I think you've got to look at this in terms of different regions. If you go to Sindh, also again, there's a very different migration pattern there than in Punjab. With certainly throughout all the violence in Punjab, there's still a large Hindu Sikh population in Sindh. And I think, as Yaqoob mentioned earlier in one of his comments, it's often the arrival of refugees that actually disturbs these quite settled populations who may not want to move as such. So you have to look at different regions and see, I think, different motivations. But I think on the whole, obviously there were some people who wanted to move, who were drawn by the Pakistan ideal to move to Pakistan. But I think for many communities, their identity was vested in their ancestral land and village. So they wouldn't leave that behind easily. They would only do this, under some kind of duress, whether it's the state organizing an exchange of population, whether it's violence, or whether it's the threat of violence or status reversal. I think all of those things come into play.
Fear was a very big motivator for a lot of the Muslims across northern India. And Jinnah didn't want all the Muslims that were coming from, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, because he was aware of the resettlement problem very much. And Nehru was astonished and hated the idea, but they couldn't stop it, really. It was so, but I think you did a very fine-grained way of liming the range of the categories of motivation. Yaqoob, from your perspective.
Yeah, just to add to what Ian has said, I think you know, if you compare the Punjab and Bengal, I think one big factor, and I think that's where, you know, squarely the blame perhaps comes to on Mountbatten, is the fact that he did not consider the big sort of problem on the Punjab side, the Sikhs. He just completely ignored it. Didn't think that they were a big issue, didn't think they'll actually blow up as a community, and that's exactly what happened. And I think that was the main distinguishing factor between the Punjab and Bengal, that whereas in Bengal it was Hindu and Muslim, in the Punjab there was a big community that was dissatisfied, that was going to be dissatisfied regardless of what the boundary, where the boundary was going to be. And that, I think, remains a very, you know, that remains one of the big indictments of Mountbatten, that he just did not take that into consideration. You had the governor of the Punjab repeatedly writing to him and saying the Sikhs are arming themselves, Muslims are arming in return, the RSS is actually doing things, what do you think we should do? And Mountbatten is very nonchalant about the whole thing. They say, well, you know, it'll be taken care of at some point or the other. And I think that's one big thing. I'll just give you one example of how the Sikhs were actually thinking about it. You know, just a couple of, you know, just last year, Pakistan opened this big Kartarpur corridor, linking the last resting place of Guru Nanak, you know, the founder of Sikhism, with India. Now, I went there a couple of years ago, and again, I was fascinated that it's only about, you know, 2.5 miles from the border, and it's only farmland. So I wondered, you know, why didn't the Sikhs just say, you know, just cut it across a little bit and, you know, get some farmland on the other side and then take it? The reason they didn't do it, or didn't really care about it, was because they wanted the Chenab as the boundary. So the question of Kartarpur just didn't emerge because their boundary was, you know, hundreds of kilometers on the other side. So you had this community that had this bizarre idea that somehow Chenab is going to be the boundary and all these colonists were actually going to be in East Punjab. And no indication was given to them that that's never going to be the case. And that is why they actually blew up. And I think that's the big failure of Mountbatten. And I would really personally, I think a lot of the thing is it's his person who ignored this, who ignored the warnings of the deputy commissioners, the superintendents of police, the governor. All of them were writing to him saying this is going to blow up, and then it did blow up, and that is what actually led to a lot of the violence. And I think so. I think that's one side of it. The other side is a lot of it was actually you know, sort of settling of old scores and everything that Ian talks about. But here, I also want to sort of plug in the work of Ian Copeland, where he's worked, where he showed that in places like the princely states of Patiala and Alwar and all these other places, it was a very planned execution of Muslims. You know, that was very well planned. They really wanted Muslims either dead or outside their princely states. And I think that's another gap that no one really thought about. Oh, there are all these princely states, places like Patiala and Kapurthala, and well, Kapurthala at least escaped, you know, a bit, and Malay Kotla completely. But then there were all these other Sikh states that had large number of Muslims in them. What is going to happen there? And it's really led by the Maharaja of Patiala that actually a real pogrom happens against the Muslims. And so, you know, in those small bits, that's really kind of a very planned and in some ways very efficient kind of ethnic cleansing, religious cleansing. And then that sets a whole chain in motion. And I think that kind of one thing adds over the other. And as Ian very aptly said, that by October, November, when the MCO kind of, the military evacuation comes up, then they have no choice. You have to just clean both sides because, you know, people are coming across. And I would say that what distinguishes the Punjabi Muhajir, so to speak, from the UP one is that the UP one actually moved for ideological reasons to what is now Pakistan. You know, they wanted to come to this Pakistan with however they imagined it. But the Punjabis actually thought, well, maybe it's for a short time, maybe we will come back. None of them, I think, really thought that this is going to be a permanent thing. So I think there are all these distinctions that are there. And of course, the violence was taking place, you know, as I said earlier, under the nose of the governments, because after a while, you need space for all the incoming refugees, you know, on both sides. So then it becomes kind of fait accompli after a couple of weeks. And by that time, you know, is it motivated? Is it not? Really doesn't, you know, those kinds of combinations and permutations, I think change to a large extent.
So thank you both. Now we're going to have to be very brief because we've got only 6 minutes left. And there are a number of good questions. So one question is, were there gender dynamics to this whole migration, the killing, the ways in which it was viewed from the authorities? This is a vast question. There have been many books, but 2 sentences, Ian, from you, and 2 sentences from Yaqoob on this question about gender dynamics.
Yes, I mean, I think obviously Urvashi Bhutalia's sort of pioneering work brought out the gender dimension, and then writers like Ritu Menon and others, you know, in terms of how women were particularly vulnerable at this time, because they were seen as the upholders of community honor, and that they could suffer not only assault from rival communities, but even from their own families, you know, in order to protect the family honor. So the vulnerability of women, I think, is important. I think another thing which has come out in the literature is that perhaps the way women remember their testimonies are different, perhaps, to men. They may talk more about family issues rather than about the bigger political picture. That's one of the things that came out in some of the interviews, you know, that I was conducting way back, you know, 15, 16 years ago, you know, that there's a different voice coming across. So there's a gender dimension. How partition is represented is different perhaps for women than men. Their vulnerability is also, I think, very different. And then the final thing is that, to the point that Aisha Jalal makes, you know, that when we're looking about opportunistic violence as opposed to politically motivated violence, then seizing women from the other community as well as land, you know, was a big motivating factor. And of course, that then led to what we reckon is 100,000 women abducted. You know, and then there's the whole business about bringing them back and what that says about the way in which they're viewed in the patriarchal society. But I'll pass over to Yaqoob.
Yeah, they became political pawns.
Yes, it did. Yeah.
Yaqoob, please, but briefly.
Well, I think Ian has said this mostly. One addition that I'd just like to make is that, you know, going through those piles of documentation, we actually found a very interesting collection of letters that was sent by the abducted women back home. And of course, as we know from the work of Urvashi Bhutalia and Ritu Menon and others, that a lot of these recovered, you know, so to speak, again, all this terminology is also very interesting. Their own families refused to accept them. And then a lot of them ended up in brothels and, you know, street prostitution, all these other kinds of things. So, you know, there was a lot of fallout with what was happening at that time. But I think, again, the whole process, and then again, a lot of them just converted and remained as Muslims or Hindus or whatever on either side. And I think so. That's again something that, you know, we know the general narrative, but I think again the locality level work would be very interesting there.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. I mean, the gender dimensions are present in every instance of forced migration, and they reflect the societies from which the people are moving. And the women in partition were, as you both noted, were ironically treated as precious vessels that had to be saved. And that meant sometimes that the husbands would put the women down the hill, down a well before they fled, so that they would not be raped. And then you had women who had a sense of agency or practicality who would say, I don't want to go back. You know, I've now been settled. It's been 2 years I'm here. It's over, you know. So it's a very complicated and fascinating story. There's one dimension we haven't talked about, and I'm going to now lead to the summation, and just, I know you both agree because you've hinted at it, which is that this debacle is tragedy. I mean, the pity of partition is that it didn't need to have happened, and that there were a large number of British authorities on both sides of what turned out to be I'm talking now about the Western border, who were writing to the Delhi and who were writing to each other, speaking about the rising tide of distress and violence, and this whole notion of what the British commissioners would be looking at, which they would call criminality with various, terms, they missed the ethnic dimension as it began to become intercommunal rather than a threat to their own authority. And Mountbatten completely missed what was going on. I mean, he really lost interest in the Indian subcontinent by May of 1947. And that is, in retrospect, a criminal failure of leadership because you had very good British authorities and Indian authorities, I mean now subcontinent Indian authorities, saying this is going to be a nightmare unless you can control it, you can stop it. And he didn't. So I feel that the culpability, if there is one for such a huge, massive event, and for historians, that's not a very good way of looking at it, culpability. I respect both of your points, but that the British need to own up to a great deal of responsibility. I'm not collectively, but the leader they had chosen and some of his advisors, not all of them who were excellent, but some of them allowed this to take place. And so it is an act of inaction that is an important thing for us to recognize. So all of you have had, I think, a pretty good insight in some of the major historical issues, the news of what is now ahead of us in terms of the 75th anniversary and what things to look for. Some deep history, some general trends and themes. Both of our historians today are really steeped in the documents, the oral narratives, and the history more generally of the subcontinent. And I want to thank them extremely for their contributions and their energy and their engagement and their alacrity in responding to different shifts in what the program is going to be. And I want to thank you as listeners and members of the audience for participating with us for this period of time and for the excellent questions that you asked. And I apologize in advance for not getting to many of the very good ones, but this is now time to sign off. And I thank you, Professor Talbot. I thank you, Professor Bangash, for your wonderful participation today. And I respect greatly the work that you both are doing in the past, now, and into the future. So with that, I would like to say goodbye to the audience, goodbye to both of you, and we look forward to engaging on this topic, perhaps not in this exact venue, but this is something the Middle Institute is very interested in for the longer term, as you both know. So thank you, and thanks to the audience for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.